you look at team dynamics in maybe a slightly different way. And that's where some real magic can happen.
Welcome to the Stakeholder Impact Forum, a Casaris platform exploring how purpose-driven organisations create change through stakeholder engagement, community, and measurable impact. Today we are joined by Steve Hill, Chief Commercial Officer at Auticon UK. Since joining the social enterprise IT consultancy supporting autistic professionals, he has championed the business case for neurodiversity through problem-solving, storytelling, and of course, technology. In this conversation, Steve reveals how Auticon is redefining the workplace by combining consultancy with social impact. He shares why personal stories matter, how to overcome fear and risk in embracing neurodiversity, the role of ambassadors, case studies, and community engagement in driving lasting change.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to hear more about Auticon and the initiatives you've been working on. But at the top, it'd be really interesting to hear from yourself, your career path, and how you kind of moved into Auticon and championing the right thing to do, in your words.
Pleasure to be here, Jonathan. Thank you so much. So I guess in a nutshell, my career is a little bit off-piste. I spent many years kind of owning and running my own business, but following that, I spent many years in tier one tech. So I've worked for IBM, Samsung, and I joined Auticon nearly 5 years ago from McLaren Formula One on the data and technology side of that business. So I guess to answer your question, it's very much a natural path, albeit it may not seem so. But fundamentally, Auticon I would describe really as Ikigai, the Japanese concept, which kind of brings together this idea of reason for being, life purpose. So it's that kind of overlapping circles, really, of what you love, what you're good at, maybe what the world needs, and maybe getting some money in compensation for that as well. So it's actually quite tricky to find. I've been really lucky to work for some fantastic organizations, big and small. But I think this is actually a kind of a culmination of all that stuff, actually, albeit I maybe didn't quite recognize it at the time. But yeah, so as Auticon, we're an IT consulting firm, so that really kind of brings together and harvests some of the experience I've got in the IT sector. But our whole reason for being is because we are a social enterprise, and all of our consultants are disclosed and diagnosed as autistic. So really, what we're trying to do is to create awareness, understanding, and education around neurodiversity, but obviously specifically through our disclosed consultants, it's really to show companies rather than tell companies what to do and how to do it. So it's that kind of whole lived experience, which we've kind of built a business that's not just in the UK, but we're in 15 countries in total, really from a position of ambition. But ultimately, it's about helping out, show companies what we do and how to do it, essentially.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really inspiring, kind of what you're doing. And you say you're a consultancy, but you're also kind of a social enterprise. And how do you kind of balance that out as a brand, Auticon? The difference there of the consultancy, the social enterprise, and quite a broad audience of people that you're engaging with. How do you kind of make that bridge between the two?
So essentially, it's really about holding ourselves to a really high standard in that sense. From a social enterprise perspective, it means that we have to uphold certain values. Many of the things are related to how we measure our social impact and how we report on our social impact. But it's also about how we reinvest profits as well. So it's all really around reinvesting into our social mission, which in very simple terms is to, again, create awareness around neurodiversity. But it's really about helping people out of unemployment and into employment. There's people with autism. So we're very, very driven around our social mission, and that's very much at the heart of what we do. So it drives the right behavior. We have to report on it, And so from a culture perspective, it means that we're able, luckily, to attract some great people, some enormous talent, both obviously from a consultant's point of view, but also from the kind of back office, the support staff, the admin staff, the sales marketing teams. It's just an amazing environment and quite a unique combination to have this for profit, but with purpose, culture all around us every day, which is, I feel very privileged.
Absolutely. And, you work with massive clients, globally recognized clients, Lloyd's, Barclays, KPMG, Deloitte, Decathlon, so many big organizations across the world. What's been your kind of, I suppose, storytelling approach of getting them to understand what it is that you as Auticon provide and how that can kind of create value and deliver impact for them as these global giants?
I mean, there isn't necessarily a one size fits all approach is probably what I'd caveat by saying. But actually, if I was going to be drawn into, how we do that as a common denominator, it's very much about mitigation of fear and risk. And what I mean by that is mitigating the fear and risk of doing or saying the wrong thing. I think lots of organizations really understand why it's important, not just ethically, in terms of doing what we do, but it's taking that next step. It's about removing those blockers, removing those barriers around really an individual level so that people don't feel like, there's a massive challenge ahead, and we make it as simple and as frictionless as possible so that we actually integrate ourselves really into the day-to-day working practices of the business. And by doing that, we're effectively then living that showing, not telling model. So education it's all very necessary. Training, absolutely, we do a lot of it, but there's nothing quite like jumping in and getting your feet wet. And we compare it to learning to swim by reading a book, which is effectively the same thing. There's nothing quite like getting in the pool under supervision and being shown how to do it. And that's effectively been the secret sauce.
Amazing. And do you have any particular tools that you found really kind of connected with people? I've seen, across Auticon, you've got quite a few different avenues of how to outreach to people and tell that story. Have you seen any particularly powerful tools for shifting perceptions?
Again, it really is down to the collection of stories and, I guess, personal circumstances largely of some of our consultants where, they've either struggled to get into work because the transition from education to the workplace can be quite challenging. And this resonates, when you start putting that into context around, to have people turn up to interviews, not necessarily knowing the questions in advance, not knowing who's going to interview them, what they're going to be asked, that can be quite anxiety inducing for anybody. So just those few descriptive sentences, we start to sort of unpick, the challenges that people can face when transitioning to the workplace. Not least of which, if we've got examples whereby we have some people that have come to us from a role that doesn't necessarily reflect their skills, their abilities, and what they could do. We've had people join us coming from coffee shops or pizza deliveries or call centers. Not that there's anything wrong with those jobs at all, but they're just not commensurate with the abilities of those individuals. And that's what we're trying to change.
Absolutely. I think that kind of comes back to what you're talking about at the top, which is the profit with purpose. And do you feel like they're mutually exclusive, purpose and profit, in your experience with Auticon and in your previous roles as well?
I think the overlap is a really interesting place to be, actually, because what we're trying to do is to demonstrate that we can act as a regular business by having, very specific reporting mechanisms, both commercially and from an impact perspective, and the two work together beautifully. And what it means, of course, is that we don't necessarily fall foul of the wrong behavior being driven just by commercial gain. We always put impact at the very heart of what we do, and we put that first. So sometimes that means we have to maybe walk away from certain things, but it's the right thing to do. And that for us is about then showing other social enterprises who might be, slightly smaller, although it might be, slightly earlier on in the journey, that a social enterprise can behave as a normal, in inverted commas, business. We made an acquisition back in 2023, very modest in the grand scheme of things, but for us, it got us into another 5 countries, and it shows you can behave like a regular business with an acquisition strategy, an international strategy, albeit with impact as your primary metric.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting, and especially with Auticon, with the kind of diverse amount of stakeholders that you interact with, from the, as you say, people just entering their career path from a coffee shop, from right up to, CEOs and thought leaders of massive companies. With that wide ecosystem, but across your members, your consultants, your clients, one of the things we're seeing is engaging those people. People can say that they're part of something, they can say that they're behind the idea, but how they actually kind of really engage and, as you say, deliver impact for you.
So again, I guess we started off very much in the IT world. So, the conversation to an IT department, IT director, CIO, CTO was very specific around the capabilities of our consultants. So everyone that joins us really comes to us with a background in IT. That doesn't have to be a degree level, and some people join us with MSCs or even PhDs. But we test them for their technical skills, no right or wrong, just baseline. But we also test for cognitive skills, which I think is quite unique, because what we see with those folks that do join us with an IT or a STEM background, we see above average skills in things like cognitive analysis, logical analysis, periods of sustained concentration, error detection, pattern matching. So when you put that together with that kind of IT leaning, it's a very potent combination. So to describe and to demonstrate the benefits of having people like that within a client team, we prove it. It's very easy for us to demonstrate. That said, what was happening and what we found was happening in our business is that at the end of that project engagement, whether it be 6 months, whether it be slightly longer, is that the conversations we were able to have were actually quite limited, in the sense of, would you like to extend our consultant? Would you like to extend projects? Would you like some more consultants? We got amazing feedback. What we needed to try and do at that time was to find a way to influence the organization as a whole. So what we'd actually been doing is creating a case study by stealth during that first engagement. And so really from there, it was about having conversations with other parts of the business. Now, whether that's maybe HR is a natural transition point to say, we've been doing this over here. We've proved the model. We've proved the business case in reality with the IT department. What we'd like to do is to help you on your journey to near inclusion as an organization. And again, there's no right or wrong with that. It's really just understanding where might there be some things that we need to focus on. And normally that starts internally with your existing employee base. So we talk about processes, procedures. It's those sorts of things that if we can get the housekeeping right, then actually the culture, the actual mechanics of the business are in a really strong position to be able to attract the type of people they need. So that was really a very logical way of our business growing, and that's how our advisory practice grew. But I think it's also symptomatic of the fact that neurodiversity has gained a lot more awareness and understanding over the past few years, particularly always in the world of DE&I, maybe was a slight runner-up in terms of gender and ethnicity. So it's great that kind of social shift and awareness has grown. And I think we're there to sort of almost handhold our clients, whether they're big, whether they're small. We're industry agnostic. It's about helping them to become more inclusive as an organization, but actually to really reap the benefits of having some fantastic and fantastically talented people that maybe otherwise they wouldn't be able to attract through just not knowing how to do it. And that's where we've seen the biggest sort of shift in the types of conversations that we're having with clients. I guess there's also the fact that in certain sectors, particularly, there are some things that help us. So, for example, the public sector, we've got the Social Value Act and the Procurement Act, which came into play earlier this year. So that's really around helping public sector procurers and public sector bidders to build social value as a metric into their bids. And so what that does is to align to some of the government objectives, particularly around helping people out of unemployment and into employment, for fair and equitable jobs, training and things like that. So from a company like ours, we're an SME, we're a VCSE, obviously being a social enterprise. So from that perspective, we come at this from a really strong position, not least of which the social value that we then demonstrate and can measure during an engagement. So that's another part of the business, which particularly in the UK, having that sort of pseudo legislation has really helped us to grow. But I guess also there's things like the Equalities Act of 2010, which really helps people with protected characteristics in the workplace and guards against discrimination. So again, we advise companies, and this might well be the HR teams, it may be general counsel, from that perspective, because neurodiversity can be seen as a disability. There's lots of grey areas, but actually from a business perspective, ignorance is no defence. But there are certainly things that companies can do to be aware of their obligations to their staff members. So these all have a cumulative positive effect. And certainly, we've been at the kind of front of that, and we've seen some of the changes in government legislation and strategies around these subjects evolve over the past couple of years, particularly.
And that's quite an interesting point you touched on there around the legislation and it's not just whilst you have a USP of getting young people with neurodiversity into these roles, it's the benefits are really, wide reaching for the organizations they're going into, for the government, for communities, for everything. What's your approach, in terms of your experience in how to get that message across when it's so wide reaching? So often you see a company that's just selling one product. It's very easy, one thing. How do you kind of approach all those benefits as one? Do you kind of target each thing? Is it bespoke? What would be your suggestion for a member organization with similar kind of benefits?
So really, I guess that the cut through is that kind of personal connection, that lived experience. So yes, we've got very definitive business case benefits. We've got the moral and ethical right thing to do piece as well. But fundamentally, we do describe ourselves as more than a company, and we are a movement. And that movement is really based upon momentum and evangelism and hand-to-hand combat. And typically what that means on a day-to-day practical level is working with people in an organization that may be a parent of a neurodivergent child, for example. They may be neurodivergent themselves. They may have had their own challenges or seen at a distance challenges faced. And so those people, those individuals are critical, no matter what the size of the organization, in helping us to navigate in terms of getting in front of the right people, but also then plugging into perhaps existing employee resource groups, for example, or those sorts of channels where we can help amplify the message. So in probably every single example of a big company, whilst we might have the route in through procurement or the route in through commercial channels or whatever it might be, we always have stakeholders who have got that personal connection, who want to make their organization better. And they see us as a modest way of being able to maybe do that in the world of neurodiversity.
Are there any kind of reoccurring challenges in trying to engage a wider ecosystem?
So I think the underlying answer to that question is economic factors. If the economy is doing well, the business is doing well, everything's buoyant, then everything's great. And companies have that little bit of extra time, money, resource to support initiatives. When things maybe aren't quite as like that, it becomes a little bit harder, and we have to really underline the business case. We have to really, double down on things like the social value. It's that, dare I say it, the compelling reason to buy. It's not that companies don't want to do it. It's just that they may not be in quite the right position to do it, and it might not be as a priority as protecting, jobs or things like that. And we recognize that. And so we recognize that every organization is on a journey, come what may, depending on their size, their maturity of understanding, their maturity of execution. But ultimately, we are, like every business, subject to the economic sort of peaks and troughs a little bit. But we try as much as we can to always stick with the clients that we have and the conversations that we're having, because for us, it's not about the money. It's about timing. And it's about that timing being right and that right jumping in point. Whether that company needs a consultant, great. Whether that company might need a free awareness session just to help propagate the message that they do care about university. They are aware of it. They might not be able to implement everything they'd like to right now, but they want to show to their internal communities that they are wanting to start the journey. And that's okay. That's where we have the ability, not being driven purely by commercial means, to give that flexibility and to give that support to our clients and new potential clients as well. It sounds a little bit nirvana-ish, if that's a term, but fundamentally it's a very refreshing way to look at business, because who can actually disagree that spending time with a new potential client that might not be spending money is a bad thing to do, because in 6 months it may be that the commercial side follows. But for us, it's about building a relationship. And again, it comes back to evangelism. The fact that we've had that touch point, we've had that conversation, can only be a good thing, even if it doesn't translate into the cash equivalent right now.
Absolutely. And I suppose economic issues are, everyone's facing them in terms of both from a sales side, but also from a connection, engagement angle. Is there any, either your own strategies or have you seen another company or not for profit that's really kind of seeming to still connect and be able to, as you say, evangelize despite those economic pressures? Or is there anything that you've singled out as a route to success? If that's not
I think
too,
that the key is actually that evangelism. I mean, we in our kind of ecosystem, we work with a lot of partners. We're exposed to a lot of partners, whether it be under the DE&I banner, but certain organizations who have themselves, the owners, the founders, have a personal lived experience, whether that's because they've been incarcerated themselves, or whether they've been subject to suffering from mental health issues or things like that. The fact they have that passion, that belief, that evangelism translate in the emotion and the power of their storytelling makes a massive difference. Yes, it could be harder in tougher economic times, but fundamentally they will keep going no matter, because their work ethic is such that that's what led them to start the business in the first place. And there's several examples of organizations that we work really quite closely with, albeit from a position of adjacency. But we recommend organizations like that, particularly where some of our clients might be looking for ecosystem partners for a public sector bid, for example, where they can absolutely make a difference at a hyper-local basis and deliver that social value, because the owners are so intrinsically involved in the social mission and making the change of which they've been a part of somehow.
Absolutely. And I suppose the other thing that we're seeing quite a lot with member organizations specifically is when you're putting that message out there, when you're trying to showcase that value, often it's great to kind of put your members at the front, put the people that are experiencing the value. How are you doing that in a kind of, do you have any kind of way of case studies and ambassadors that you are able to lean on to spread the message?
So ambassadors is a really interesting subject in itself. You may be aware, obviously, that Richard Branson and Virgin Group are shareholders and investors in us, and that was actually what led me to Auticon, my youngest son being dyslexic, and I follow Richard Branson as someone that's famously dyslexic and promotes dyslexic thinking. So that sort of power and support obviously has a huge cut-through ability, not just from a UK perspective, but internationally. So there's that end of the scale, but equally, it's also the very personal stories that we bring out in case studies, normally via our consultants or in combination with our neuro inclusion advisors as well, who are on our staff, who support our consultants, but also act as a bridge between the clients and consultants on engagement. It's those sorts of stories that actually become really powerful in terms of maybe tracking a little bit of the backstory and really the success of providing that level of support within Auticon, such that when people leave us, we see that as a success, because it means that they've come from a situation which wasn't optimal. Now, whether that was another workplace that didn't provide or couldn't provide an adequate level of support, or whether it's just because they were coming through from an educational background, but they found their home here for a period of time and then successfully transited onto the next opportunity and grew as a person. We don't see Auticon necessarily as a home for life. We have lots of people that really do enjoy working here. They like the support they get. They like that kind of environment that we have here, and they genuinely want to be here for many years. And we have some of our consultants that have been here since we started the UK office in 2016. Equally, we have consultants that have spent maybe 2 or 3 years here. They've grown in confidence and technical ability. They've been exposed to some additional commercial projects, which are super interesting for them. And it's really helped them to take that next step in their career, which maybe without coming here, they wouldn't have been able to do ordinarily. So that is those sorts of case studies where there isn't a one size fits all that actually become really powerful anchor points for our clients and to evangelize around.
Totally. Do you feel that there's an issue with, especially larger organizations or particularly member organizations where there's a wide range of stakeholders, that actually you can end up almost being siloed into a specific conversation that's only about that, and rather than people seeing something like neurodiversity or economic pressures as something that everyone should be talking about? And how do you overcome that?
Again, it's about having the right conversation with the right type of stakeholders. We do spend time with the C-suite talking about the business case for neuro inclusion, and really offering up the benefits and actually drawing and pulling reference points from trusted sources. So, for example, in 2024, Gartner's top 10 predictions cited neurodiversity as one of the top things that Fortune 500 companies would be paying attention to in 2025, well, in 2027 onwards, as a competitive advantage. So having those trusted sort of advisors in the market, as it were, at large, becomes very useful anchor points for us, because again, it comes back to, whilst we don't say this, and our clients of course would never say this, but it's about why should they care? Everyone agrees it's morally and ethically the right thing to do, but it's about giving the right sort of anchor points and the right evidence. We're just about to launch a campaign around edge thinking, and this is really coming from a position again of the same type of narrative, but it's really inspired by the ecological concept of the edge effect, where effectively where two ecosystems meet, you get a very diverse an innovative overlap of those two ecosystems. So think of that in the business context, where you've got a very large organization and a very small organization, and we're maybe crossing over with the point of providing augmented resource in the form of our consultants. It's at that point where some really unique things can happen in terms of innovation, the consequential benefit of working with someone that's openly disclosed and diagnosed as autistic, and all the positives that come with that in terms of, very direct communication styles, for example. So, there's no such thing as office politics or dancing around the houses or things like that. And it's really refreshing to see how that in the overlap really starts to change the dynamic and really helps people become better managers and better colleagues in that environment. So this idea of edge thinking and the overlap of two slightly different ecosystems is really where great insights can happen, and where different minds really kind of come to meet in a very structured and supportive way. So it's that stealth type case study, which again, we're trying to take to the next level, where structured systems meet minds that maybe think outside the box, and they think outside the box naturally, but we give them the environment to be able to do it with support and disclosure. And those things actually are really quite important, because we're all familiar with team dynamics and, the loudest voice in the room and things like that. But when you start to really understand neurodiversity and the things that come with that, you look at team dynamics in maybe a slightly different way. And that's where some real magic can happen.
It's exactly, kind of, when you see organizations that put people out of their comfort zone, it's really interesting to hear, and it's great to hear that Auticon is experiencing that. Have you kind of experienced any other effective strategies that, have made you think, that's how they get the C-suite out of the building, and actually thinking around the types of topics that you're working on?
The simplest form that we see is by meeting our consultants. And that really is that's the lived experience. And it doesn't necessarily even mean, working on a project. It's just interacting. And just from that perspective, having that different conversation, witnessing, just a slightly different approach. But everything's out in the open. And I think that's the key. It's everything being supported, but in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that, our consultants or the conversations are directed via our coaches or anything like that. It's just about creating the right conditions to have those conversations in the first place.
You mentioned previously about the Bridge of Hope and kind of how they take CEOs to the Clink prison, Brixton prison. Why do you think that's effective in kind of changing the kind of how the synapses are connecting and how they look at engagement?
I think it's very easy for everyone naturally to put people into a stereotypical type of box. And I think it's by taking people outside of their comfort zones in that example. And actually, again, the same principles apply insofar as, everyone that works in that prison restaurant is an inmate. And so therefore, from that perspective, you're changing the dynamics and you're changing the conversation, but you're doing it in a way that's breaking down some of those stereotypical ideas. And it's not until we can actually do that and see that firsthand that perhaps, it's that next step, isn't it? It's that, take people out of their comfort zone, put them into a slightly different environment, and then they get to have a changed perspective. So they do it brilliantly from their perspective. As I alluded to earlier, they are so passionate about their stories, their backstory, and making a change that they're in it every day, trying to make a difference and do a fantastic job doing it. I think our approach is maybe slightly different, but we're still trying to do the same thing, but albeit, taking people out of their comfort zones and showing them rather than just telling them.
And just kind of wrapping up on that side of things, what do you see as the kind of biggest mindset shifts that people need to overcome, or organizations need to overcome, around employment and neurodiversity? Because as you say, it has almost taken a backseat to other areas in recent years, and now it is starting to, I'd say, gain traction from my experience. But what are the kind of big obstacles that you would see in that sense from Autocon's experience?
I think that obviously the larger the organization, sometimes it is the old analogy of getting an oil tanker to turn, and it can take time to do so. That said, I think, there are various factors which expedite the need to do it, which we've already touched on. But I think it's also future generations coming up who have an expectation from organizations that, the way that interviews are constructed, can't be the same. They want to research a company, and they want to work for a company that has high ethical and moral standards, and they want to see a policy. They want a perspective on neurodiversity, and that company is aware and supportive of those people in their organization. It's these sorts of things which are going to be able to keep organizations competitive, no matter what their size. It has to be that recognition, and ignorance is no defense in any sense. And so what we're seeing with some of the trends coming through from Gen Z is that there is a definite marked willingness to work for companies that have that kind of social, environmental, ethical conscience, and the storytelling that organizations have to have around it, but also the evidence that this is in practice. It's no good just to put a few words of, corporate social responsibility on a website, and that's it. It's got to be part of the DNA of the organization.
Which is a perfect segue into, you mentioned social value there, and you're a judge for the Social Value Awards. How is that kind of an establishment that is recognizing, as you say, those types of social parameters? How is that kind of helping to further the message and to build communities and pathways for younger people who, as you say, do see that as a direct route into their career?
I think for us, it's a number of different things. It's being at the sort of cutting edge of seeing some of the programs that are happening to deliver social value across the country on a daily basis. So I feel very privileged to have seen some of those programs and the hard work that's happening that lots of us we would never even know, and it's phenomenally impressive. And I think, the UK government should be applauded for, putting that Social Value Act and the Procurement Act in place so that, the commercial, race to the bottom on price is not the competitive factors on which government bids and tenders are won. So it takes time to permeate, but the refresh to the social value model and the Social Value Act has all taken it in the right direction. I think, for us, it is about the kind of thought leadership as well. It's about being close to and keeping ourselves on point as well as to how we might be able to innovate and deliver social value, particularly when you're thinking about a hyper local level. We've still got so much ambition and so much work to do. When we think about, national tenders, or even, very local authority tenders, how might we innovate some of our services to be able to deliver that at a very local level to make a difference? And how do we measure that? And how do we measure it over a longer period of time? What interventions can we do, or should we be thinking about in terms of our business planning? At the moment, we're very much about neurodiversity in the workplace, but that may well be an evolution for us in terms of how do we take what we're doing into the educational sector? How do we maybe think about interventions at a younger age, maybe at primary school age? How do we take and track that journey such that there isn't the very sobering employment statistics around autistic adults? How can we maybe start to put interventions in place that make a difference much earlier on from a chronology perspective, so that we're not necessarily focused on fixing it here? We can maybe intervene a lot earlier on in the process.
Okay, but and with the Social Value Awards, are you seeing much kind of knowledge sharing and facilitation of how everyone can learn from, something that might be happening in a tiny town in Wales or something.
And I think that's the key point with things like the awards, because, the judging criteria is kind of set. So it's not necessarily all big companies rolling out big programs. It's as easy for, a small local authority to put a really good measurement criteria in place and to demonstrate social value as it is a big company that maybe has a greater power to influence to deliver that. So it's not specific to size. It's really about the measurable impact. And what we're seeing as well is that the government are talking about introducing targets for use of SMEs. So it's not just, the consequential impact of that. It's really growing the fact that SMEs, VCSEs have an increased ability to be able to be part of an ecosystem, to be able to deliver that as well. So I see a real boost for SMEs, and it's a lot of the procurement barriers are being eroded away to make it easier for SMEs and VCSEs to transact in the government and public sector as well. So it's all moving in the right direction. Everyone wants it to be, to be now, but the trajectory is really, really positive.
I suppose just the last point on that is really, how are they putting out that story of these fantastic initiatives? And have you seen like a particular one this year where you're thinking, wow, how many organizations could learn from this? What's the best approach to kind of sharing more knowledge? And is there a value in this kind of taking away sectors, cross-sector learning from whatever it is, small SME, local authority initiative, major corporation, rather than, I think in the past, there's always been this kind of, hierarchy in learn from the top, build, grow up.
I think, organizations like Social Value Portal, who run the Social Value Awards, they're great because they just cut across everything in terms of, they work with the strategic suppliers into government. They work with government, they really are across everything. And so they're really important. I mean, they're not alone. There are some other organizations as well who do an equally great job, but it's organizations like that who they propagate the good news stories. They promote the best practice. They showcase, with real provenance, the different types of social value that's being delivered in different parts of the country at all levels, which is great because it's that guiding light. It is that kind of best practice leading, thought leadership that inspires organizations to do better, but also for new entrants into the market to say, actually, whilst the economic conditions may be a little bit tricky, this is a good time to do what we want to do because we have a route to be able to deliver it and measure it and actually see the results of what we're doing. So there's so many cumulative benefits. Everything that I saw from a judging perspective, and we're just sort of in the final throes of putting forward those judging criteria, but it sounds cliched, but every submission that I saw was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, it to a humbling level, and we've all been at award ceremonies where everyone, is expecting to say that everything was so close or the entries are brilliant. They were brilliant, and they had demonstrated, real significant measured social value to the point where you think, wow, this is making a massive difference. And so the obligation of not just award sites and awards, it's telling those stories and getting those stories out there.
Fantastic. And I suppose that segues into, why you're part of this stakeholder impact forum. What is it that you feel shared forums and sharing best practice, sharing knowledge, what, especially around something as necessary as inclusion and impact right now? What's your kind of reason for joining the Stakeholder Impact Forum, and what are you hoping to spread in terms of the knowledge?
Again, it comes down to evangelism. I think, once you reach a kind of certain age or a certain point in your career, it's not all about, the money you make at the end of every month. And it's, you have a wider peripheral vision about the things that you see, the things that you want to make as changes, whether it's in your own organization or, slightly beyond that. And I think, from my perspective and my vantage point, being in a very fortuitous position in Auticon, we bring out the best in everybody. That doesn't necessarily always mean that we can do everything for everybody, but we have the ability to pretty much walk into any room. We have to earn the right to stay there, clearly, but, and that's great, because what that means is that, we genuinely bring out the best in everybody. And what we see is that companies genuinely want to do right by their staff. They want to improve. They want to put things in place to make their culture, their DNA, better. They want to be able to attract and retain staff. It's all of those things. It's just sometimes the constraints of timing or resources don't quite allow companies to do everything they want to do at once. But overridingly, we never have a bad conversation with an organization. We've never had a conversation where a company would say, no, we're not really interested in that. We don't see neurodiversity as something that we should be paying attention to, which is actually really quite heartening, because, in the cut and thrust of business, particularly, with publicly traded companies, the metrics, quite rightly, are driven on a 90-day cycle. But actually, in our world, we have the ability to sort of look at these organizations from a slightly different angle, which is great, because everyone wants to do the right thing. It's just about when and how. So by having that kind of message, when, from a news broadcasting perspective, it's not always sunshine and roses. I think and our responsibility is to sort of spread a little bit more cheer, sometimes, to offset some of that, which is great, because again, it comes back down to that power of evangelism, and actually leveraging it from a position of real life stories and real life change and impact.
Absolutely. And just finally, being part of the Stakeholder Impact Forum, is there a particular key challenge for the other thought leaders, mix experts who are part of this forum, that they might have already solved, that you would like to kind of propose to them and connect with them?
It's a really, really good question. I mean, I think, we all come at these things from our own position of interest, passion, experience. And I think the more that we can do to just share stories is incredibly powerful from a cumulative perspective. So having that audience in a very structured way is amazingly powerful. And fantastic job that you guys are doing there.
Steve, thanks so much for joining us today, and really inspiring to hear everything that Autocon's doing, and looking forward to seeing what you've got in store going forward, and more people connecting with you as part of the forum. Thank you so much, and we look forward to sharing more about Autocon's story going forward.
Wonderful. A real pleasure. Thank you.